the Philippines, where I come from UK. Anyway, you're all welcome. I am Joanne Carling. I am co-director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, and also the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. And we are co-hosting this webinar together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and the Sami Council. I would like to just make this announcement. It's been running, but just for those that are just joining us now, that we would like you to introduce yourself on the chat box if you're open to it, so that we at least know who are listening, who are engaging in this. And also, if there are Spanish speakers, please use the interpretation and go to use the interpretation and click Spanish. And also for our French speaking participants, please go to the interpretation and click the French button. We would also like you to be active, engage in this discussion by using the button for Q&A if you have questions. And it would be good if you can also direct your question to any of the participants. And we would also encourage you to give your comments on the chat box. So before I start, I mean, the reason why we're having this webinar on renewable energy and Indigenous peoples is because Indigenous peoples are fully supporting the just transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy as one of the key solutions to climate change, and also for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It's one actually of the goals, Goal 7, in terms of providing clean energy for all. So we are hosting this discussion because there will be the Forum on Business and Human Rights next week. And we know that there's a big shift also in business in relation to renewable energy, and we want to know what's the state of affairs in relation to renewable energy and Indigenous peoples. Is there a way where it can be beneficial for the people and the planet? So we have a number of speakers here. We actually have 4 speakers who will be sharing their experience or engagement or work in relation to renewable energy and Indigenous peoples. We have 2 Indigenous leaders who will be presenting their own experience with renewable energy in their territories. And then we have one that is working with business, and they are working directly with renewable energy companies or corporations. And one of the speakers is working on human rights and development, and have also expertise on the issue of Indigenous peoples. So this session will run for 1.5 hours. It will be a moderated session. I will be asking, sorry, I did not put on my video, sorry. I will be asking questions to our speakers. And then after all the speakers, we will then have the Q&A. And we will end with their brief remarks, particularly in providing what actions are needed in relation to Indigenous peoples and renewable energy in relation to the work of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So before I proceed with our speakers, let me introduce a bit our speakers. So first we will have Christina Henriksen. She is the president of the Sami Council. Christina is from, well, sorry, I cannot pronounce it, but she's on the Norwegian side of the Sami borders of Finland and the Russian Federation. She represents the Norwegian Sami Association in the council and served as a member of the Sami parliament on the Norwegian side for the period of 2013 to 2017. Christina's academic background comprises political, social, and religious science, Russian history, and French and North Sami languages. She has professional experience from the Barents-Euro cooperation, including cooperation with indigenous partners and organizations in the North and project cooperation with Russia, as well as with the EU relations in Brussels. She is an educated teacher. She has been in the leadership of the Sami organizations for 20 years. So that is Christina Henriksen from the Sami people. Now we also have Praveen Shakya, who is the executive director of the Community Empowerment and Social Justice SEMSOJ network in Nepal. Prabindra or Praveen is a human rights activist from Indigenous Newar community of Nepal. He has been engaged in promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and marginalized communities for over a decade now, whereby he specializes on human rights, advocacy in the context of impacts of development finance, business operations, and international investments. He has extensive working experience at regional and international levels as a consultant with the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York, a Human Rights Program Coordinator and Advisor of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact in Thailand, and a steering committee member and Asia Regional Representative of the Coalition of Human Rights in Development, among others. He currently coordinates the Community and Empowerment and Social Justice Network in Nepal that he founded and has previously worked with different human rights organizations in the country. Our third speaker is Jessie Kato. She is the program manager of natural resources and human rights of the Human Rights and of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. She is responsible for coordinating the resource center's work related to natural resources, including leading projects on renewable energy and transition minerals. Prior to this, Jessie worked at Oxfam America, coordinating their extractive industries knowledge hub, and was also previously the National Director for Publish What You Pay in Australia. The fourth speaker is Birgitte Feiring, Department Director of Human Rights and Development at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. She leads the leading work to ensure that the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs are reached in a manner that realize human rights for all and leave no one behind. Birgitte has worked more than 30 years in intertwined fields of sustainable development and human rights and has experience from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Birgitte has worked extensively on measurement of human rights and development outcomes, including by developing a comprehensive indicator-based monitoring framework for indigenous peoples' rights and development, and by analyzing and promoting a human rights-based approach to SDG monitoring. Birgitte is currently the chair of the SDG Working Group of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. So as you see, we have a set of powerful speakers. So I will then now proceed first with Christina from the Sami Council. So Christina, in the recent weeks, the Sami people in Norway are gaining media attention in relation to the plan of the government to set up a windmill farm in the Sami territory. Can you kindly tell us your concerns on how are these being addressed and how these concerns are being addressed by the government and the companies involved? So Christina, kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair Joan, and thank you for inviting us, the Sami Council, to this panel. Unfortunately, we're not talking about simply one wind power plant in Sápmi. We are talking about what I would call an invasion of so-called green industry moving into the Sami territory. And it is based on an assumption that the world or Europe needs more energy, while we are in Norway capable of producing energy for our own use. But this wave of green industry is also put forward by foreign investors eager to make money on our land. But I believe what you're referring to is the situation within the area of the South Sami community of Gillen-Jarke. It's located in the southern part of Nordland County in Norway. The community depends on access to land and migration routes to be able to implement the seasonal migrations and activities such as the calving period, which obviously is crucial for the livelihood of the families of the community. And this particular community has never consented to giving land up for this power plant, this wind power plant. But still, during the spring migration in April, which is also the time the calving might start, the community was prevented from moving as the construction of the infrastructure for the wind power plant had already started. The community was supported by the Sami parliament and regional authorities as well, and they complained that the preconditions for the license given were violated. The construction activities were supposed to halt during migration. But the Norwegian government, the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, overruled the complaint with the reason given that the developer had already initiated the activities and they were pointing towards the financial risks taken by the developing company. Obviously, it turned out the assumption that forgiveness is easier obtained than permission proved right for this corporation. Although the developer had deliberately commenced the construction without clarifying the relationship to this reindeer herding indigenous community. So what happened was that the community sued the corporation in question, Øyfjellet Vind, and lost in Oslo District Court in the capital. And the community, consisting of many families from the Sami society, is sentenced to pay for all the expenses from the counterpart, which is estimated to around 1.6 million Norwegian kroner, or about 150,000 euros, or I think about 180,000 US dollars. So it's a significant amount, which the community has not been able to raise itself. But there has been this tremendous efforts by the civil society around this community fundraising to help out. So that is at least one good sign. However, the Sami Council has addressed the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples on this matter, and referring to violations of both international legislation on indigenous peoples' rights, as well as the national law on reindeer herding in Norway. And I would like to mention also that there are, although there is not enough, there's never enough assessment done and research on the impact on reindeer and traditional livelihoods from wind power plants. But there are reports showing that the reindeer will avoid the windmills. So if they are put up, the pasture land is lost. And I would like to mention also a second case, which applies for Orjel-Fosen-Jarke, which is also a South Sami reindeer herding community. And the South Sami is a marginalized part of the Sami community because they are so widespread and rather few, and their language is very, very fragile and threatened. And this is just north of Trondheim. And this community has fought the construction of a wind power plant for almost 20 years, with the last years of this conflict being held in courts. So the wind power plant is constructed. It has taken away lots of winter pasture land for this community. And in June this year, the Court of Appeals ruled with providing some compensation for this community.
Is she frozen or
yes?
I'm the one? Okay, continue.
This is another case. Yeah, the point is that we are waiting for the Supreme Court to decide whether or not this will be taken as an issue, a case to the Supreme Court. But the government of Norway has stated that they are on the side of the construction companies against the reindeer herding community. So that is a very clear signal from the government that wind power plants are and the economy is what we are putting our efforts on. And these are two among many cases that are faced by Sami communities, both in the Norwegian side but also in the Swedish side at the moment. There are international companies and investors approaching the Sami communities, talking about dialogue, but I would say that the principle of dialogue or the nature of this dialogue has to be questioned. There is a lot of information going on and promises about local economy blossoming, and but in the end there is not much left for the Sami communities.
Mm-hmm. So with that, Christina, that this windmill are really seriously impacting the livelihoods of the Sami people, particularly affecting the reindeer herding area. Have you presented this to the government, and what has been the response so far? Because they're in principle supposed to also respect the rights of the Sami people. What's your sense on how this will be addressed by the government, given that there is a protest among the Sami people concerned?
Well, I think the two examples I mentioned proves that the government is not being very clear on the Sami rights on this, and pushing the companies in front of them, arguing that so much money is already spent that they will lose too much money if they were supposed to quit. And although also the Sami Council communicated to the Convention on Elimination of Racial and Discrimination to the UN regarding the latter case I mentioned, and Norway was told to halt the activities and to wait for the final decision, but they didn't. They refused to do that, so they just moved on, hiding behind the economy, and that is the signal we are given in many cases, as lots of cases are put through court at this time regarding Sami rights in Norway.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you recommend then as actions to be taken to ensure that the rights of the Sami people are respected in this case?
Well, I would encourage, of course, the government and the business to follow the principles and to make sure that rights are respected. That dialogue is based on the principles that we have agreed on internationally. That you can give or not give consent based on in prior information, right? But at this time, with both these cases and a lot of other cases, there is there is no respect for this right to give or not give consent. And
yeah, that's it's very concerning for us, because as everybody is saying that renewable energy is good for the climate, and it's the way for sustainable development. But in your case, it's actually the opposite. It's destroying your land and your livelihood and the culture of the Sami people. So in the later discussion, maybe we can see how the UN Business and Human Rights framework can be used to advance the respect for the rights of the Sami people. Now we proceed to Nepal, which is also experiencing the same kind of problem with so-called renewable energies, but in this particular situation, it's more related to dams. So Praveen, you have been working with indigenous communities affected by large dam projects in Nepal. And you're also working with some of the investors to these projects. So can you please tell us what's the status of these projects, and what has been the impact to the communities, and how are you also engaging with the investors to these projects? Praveen, take the floor.
Yes, thank you, Zohan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's how we start all the meetings in these challenging times now. Can you hear me is the first thing we say. So Jojalapa, namaste, good evening to everyone who's attending this webinar, and thanks Zohan and organizers for hosting this. Before I'm particularly going to respond to Zohan's questions by sharing the experiences of one particular community that is affected by it's not a mega hydro dam project, but it's a medium scale hydropower project, which is being co-financed by Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, and Japan International Cooperation Agency in Western Nepal. No, but firstly, to give you a brief context, Nepal is it's this country in South Asia. It's supposed to be the second wealthiest or second richest country in the world in terms of inland water resources. It's estimated hydropower potential is around 50,000 megawatt, and only 1,000 megawatt of that has been produced or used so far. No. So there's this and government, businesses, and other stakeholders, investors see hydropower as the pathway for Nepal's development or progress, prosperity. And it's very difficult in Nepal these days to challenge any hydropower project, but salute to this community in Western Nepal and other communities in different parts of the country, which are standing for their rights in the even in these challenging context of whereby these hydropower projects are termed as only way for development of the communities and the nation. No, so as you were saying, Johan, hydropower in Nepal is projected as renewable or green energy, but also it has been seen that most of the projects in Nepal which are run of the river are not truly green because they destroy river concern in this community that we are talking about. No, I'm trying to share my screen here, so let me know if you are able to see it. No, hold on just 1 second. So yeah, and while we started to work with this community in 2016, I have to say that there was little information with these communities that these what are going to be the pros and cons, or if they can even challenge this project for the impacts that they were facing. Can you see my screen, John? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, our journey began in 2016 when you and I were actually working together. We first heard about this project from our international networks about these development bank watchers, and so that's when we sent this information to the local local partners, local organizations in Nepal, and asked them if they have heard any concerns about about this project, no, from the local communities. So one of the partners, which is an indigenous indigenous women's lawyers group, came back to us saying that, there are some concerns. There are concerns about lack of consultation. There are concerns about compensation. There are concerns about impacts, ranging from land rights impacts to to losing livelihoods, to other impacts, no, basically participation, benefit sharing, all of those. So but when they first reached out, there was little information. So in 2017, that indigenous women's lawyers group, which is called Indolag, and we, together with other national partners and international partners, carried out this community led research, which basically presented a very how do you call it, drastic or vivid picture of this, of what is actually happening in the community, like most of the people, they were 62, as you can see, 62% of the affected communities that they surveyed, were concerned about losing access to farmland. They were concerned. 52% were also concerned about losing access to grazing lands. But when you see the numbers regarding consultation, 75% of the respondents said that they were not consulted during the planning phase at all. Only 2% said that they think they have needed information to provide any ideas about the project, any opinion about the project, and 93% even said that they were not given any opportunity to propose other ideas of development that they might have at the community level. And when we did this project, the project was already in the construction phase. The construction was already starting. There was already a signed agreement with ADB, EIB, JICA. But you can see only 84% of the affected families that were surveyed had received any compensation. So that basically presents the picture, that the first challenge that these communities face is basically they don't get the information. When we went to the community, we went to these far-flung remote villages. You can see we have to go through these belly bridges, as you can see in the bottom of the slide. We have to go through these belly bridges. They did not receive. They did not have any idea about the public hearings that were consulted with the support of JICA for the technical feasibility of the project. So yeah, I mean, it was basically through us that they learned that this was an ADB or EIB co-finance project. In JICA was also involved. They learned about ADB's safeguard policies. They learned about relevant laws of Nepal, and so yeah, these 200 families formed up into different committees, and then they started lobbying with the project, with the company that is constructing the project, which is a government-owned company, government entity-owned company. And they at that time they actually had presented, I think, 14 or 15 list of demands. Out of those 14 or 15 list of demands, two were primary. First, that they wanted was what they wanted was access to all the documents regarding the project in understandable form. They wanted greater consultation with regards to compensation determination. They wanted also how do you call it, the participation in impact assessment. Yeah. So after that process, just quickly, John. After that process, there were some efforts made by the company, and some additional packages, financial packages were given, but still 32 families were not convinced. And what they did was they actually filed a complaint with the Asian Development Bank and European Investment Bank. What they specifically called for was respect for their pre, prior, and informed consent in terms of adequate compensation for their lands and livelihoods. So right now, what's the status is that ADB and EIB are investigating in the project. So yeah, that's the stage right now, and these are the demands that they have presented.
Yeah. So are you optimistic that somehow ADB and the EIB will give a favorable response to the demands of the communities?
In course of the investigation that they have done, they have now produced what they call a review and assessment report. In the review and assessment report, they have positively noted, or at least incorporated most of the comments made by the community, and also taken into account responses made by other side, or the government side or the company side. Some of the demands, I would say, have already been met. No, they have provided for an interpreter in Mughal language, indigenous Mughal language. So that's already a win for the community. Now they are able to better participate in the process. But still, participation is only one step towards their obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent. No, and the key demand of the community is that there is also greater assessment of their grazing lands, their communal lands, their non-title lands, and for their title lands, they want land for land resettlement, or they don't want they don't think it's a financial commodity, that their land, and they want to leave it for their future generations. So if we have some faith, let's see, the ADB complaint mechanism that is leading the process has been quite positive. We have some good faith negotiations happening, and which will be followed by multi-stakeholder consultations. But again, the greater problem I see is the lack of laws in Nepal, because in the compensation determination is guided by the law of Nepal, which do not take into account for communal lands or untitled lands, or grazing lands. So yeah, so that is going to be a bigger challenge. However, I would say if this leads to a favorable judgment in the favor of the communities, this will be a very once in a precedent case. No.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for that, Praveen. I think you have highlighted some additional key points also after Christina's presentation, which is one, the issue of land, that from the perspective of indigenous peoples, this is not a commodity. And that anyone who wants to make use of any land needs the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. And that the participation, that part of the free, prior, and informed consent is the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in decision making on matters that affects them, including in finding solutions to energy issues, and not automatically large dams as the solution, right? So I think from the two experiences of indigenous peoples, we can see clearly that the rights of indigenous peoples are not respected, both by the companies but also the government, which is the reality that indigenous peoples are facing across the world. Now, let's see if we look at now the wider picture in terms of the behavior of renewable energy companies, now that they are using, what is considered as an environment-friendly technology. Is this also respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and other communities that are affected? So for this, I want to get to Jessie from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which has been tracking allegations of human rights across many sectors, including renewable energy. And they have analyzed the human rights policies and practices of renewable energy companies. So Jessie, what trends are you seeing from this sector, the renewable energy companies, and what conclusions did you reach from this analysis, and where do you see the biggest gaps in companies' respect for human rights? So Jessie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute privilege to be here today. So thank you very much for inviting the Resource Centre. And what two fantastic presentations to follow. It's a tough act for me to follow, I think. But so at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, we see the renewable energy sector as absolutely central to the transition to a net zero carbon global economy. And we see the energy transition itself as a human rights imperative. We know that climate change will impact all people, but that will disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people. And so as a human rights organization, we have a vested interest in seeing the sector succeed, but we can't see this happening if the work isn't undertaken in a rights respecting way. And what we've seen is a concerning rise in allegations of human rights abuses in the renewable energy sector. Over the last 10 years, we have collected nearly 200 allegations of abuse related to renewable energy projects across all regions of the world. However, Latin America has the highest amount of allegations, with 61% of the allegations that we've collected. What we've also seen is that allegations in the renewable energy sector are rising. So we see these allegations occur across the value chain. There are those that occur as a direct consequence of renewable energy projects, and there are those that happen further up the supply chain around mining sites for minerals used in renewable energy technology. We monitor those allegations specifically through our transition minerals tracker. And the types of allegations we are seeing around renewable energy projects are similar in nature to human rights allegations that you would typically associate with large-scale extractive projects. So land rights violations, displacement, Indigenous rights violations, harassment of the human rights and environmental defenders, and sometimes occasionally violence and threats against local communities, but particularly those communities that are voicing their opposition to projects. And this is particularly concerning as it relates to Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples are really on the front line, both of climate change impacts and of the energy transition. And too often we find land and livelihoods are once again under threat from a new industry and from a rapidly expanding industry. We're not seeing renewable energy companies take the steps that are needed to ensure that respect for Indigenous people's rights is embedded in their operations. And we see this, for example, in Mexico and Central America, where we have Indigenous peoples opposing everything from large hydropower projects to wind farms and solar farms that infringe on their land or are undertaken without free, prior and informed consent. But I think from the sessions we've already had today, you see this is a global issue and it's happening in many countries. To explore the human rights due diligence in the renewable energy sector further, in August, we launched our first renewable energy and human rights benchmark. And this looks at 16 of the largest publicly traded wind and solar energy companies in the world and represents over 130,000 megawatts of wind and solar operating capacity. The results of the benchmark suggest that none of the companies analysed are currently fully meeting their responsibility to respect human rights as defined by the UN Guiding Principles. Nearly half of the companies we benchmarked scored below 10%, 3/4 scored below 40%, and the average across the 16 companies was just 22%. So although this is a low score, this is on par with other high-risk industries that we monitor at the Resource Centre, and that includes the extractive sector. What we have seen from the benchmark, though, is that there is an overall lack of policy and procedures in place for companies to ensure they are following human rights due diligence. But we also see a disconnect between policy and actual practices of companies. So the lack of a human rights policy strongly correlated with allegations of abuse. And we could see the broader patterns of renewable energy allegations that we collect around renewable energy related to FPIC and land rights replicated in this smaller subset of allegations in the benchmark. So allegations relating to land grabbing featured in the benchmark. And what was reflected was that the company scored 0 points, every company, for having a policy to respect land rights, to govern the process of land acquisition, or on a just and fair relocation of residents. On indicators that assessed companies' commitments to respect Indigenous peoples and affected community rights, the average score for companies was 0.28 out of 6, or 5%. Only one company has a specific public commitment, that is the Spanish company, Iberdrola, to respect Indigenous people's rights in line with the ILO Convention 169. And despite that policy, they also have allegations against them of violating the rights of Indigenous communities in both Mexico and Brazil. So, and no company, and I think this is important relating to the last 2 sessions as well, no company received credit for publicly disclosing its process for understanding who is an Indigenous person, what constitutes customary, ancestry, or collective land rights, territories, or resources. So really our research as a whole is showing there's a long way to go.
That's quite very unfortunate to hear that these renewable energy companies have not yet fully aligned themselves to really making a strong commitment to respect human rights. Now, under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, what are your recommendations for governments who are the ones responsible in regulating these companies? How can they push companies to respect human rights?
I mean, governments have a central role to play, and it's not just under the UNGPs, because the governments are responsible for the promotion of renewable energy for climate transition targets. And so there's an opportunity for them to create a responsible industry from the start.
Yeah.
We recommend that governments bring in or need to bring in legislation that tackles the climate crisis, but also lifts the floor of corporate behavior while ensuring their own funding for clean energy and energy access considers human rights implications. The home governments of these companies should adopt stronger requirements for companies to do human rights due diligence and human rights impacts assessments. And certainly we've seen some heartening movement from the EU to move forward on mandatory human rights due diligence.
Yeah.
But the host governments where these projects are located can also incorporate stronger protections into their own national energy policies and energy plans. We see with the evidence from our allegation monitoring how important it is for governments also to have recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to customary lands, the need for more countries to ratify ILO Convention 169, and the need for governments to ensure that companies are ensuring companies respect, the right to free, prior and informed consent. If we see climate change, and we do, as the most prominent threat to human rights, therefore the energy transition is absolutely necessary. It's going to continue, we can't stop it. The negative human rights records of those companies and the governments that allow those companies to operate with those kind of actions and records will threaten the development of renewable energy sector and ultimately then the success of the energy transition, which threatens all of us.
Yes, yes, certainly. That's why Indigenous peoples have been demanding in the climate change processes that solutions should be fully aligned to human rights, to the respect for human rights, and the accountability of states should be clearly stressed when they take action for the climate change. And that's exactly, I think, where we find ourselves in relation to renewable energy. So thanks a lot for that, Jessie. Now we move on to getting a bit more traction on the issue of renewable energy and Indigenous peoples, and how can we address the conflicts around renewable energy and Indigenous peoples. So Brigitte, DIHR has been engaging with governments and national institutions in the context of renewable energy. What are your observations in relation to Indigenous peoples and renewable energy? And what do you think are the key steps in turning conflicts into constructive engagement and collaboration in strategies to achieve the SDG 7 on clean energy and also in combating climate change? So Brigitte, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you to the other presenters for very powerful, strong examples and presentations. Unfortunately, from national human rights institutions, our experiences and observations resonate with what we have just heard, because we see conflicts across the globe related to the expansion of energy projects. Costa Rica, Kenya, Chile, Brazil, Georgia, the list is really endless. And historically, these conflicts have been related to oil and gas extraction or large-scale hydropower, but now we see the projects associated with wind power, solar, geothermal, and others generating the exact same kind of conflicts. So at the project level, what we see, and it has also been shared here, is that state authorities, they jump to these projects without thorough and comprehensive options assessments, and that they actually give out the licenses to operate to companies without having undertaken adequate consultation and without achieving consent of the affected communities. So whenever the companies come into the picture, there's already a conflict from the outset, because the project, as we also heard from Norway, the project has already been decided upon. And also we see a very narrow and very legalistic interpretation of FPIC, where it's rather than embracing the spirit of consultation, participation, and consent, we see attempts to limit the scope of the application of free, prior, informed consent, which may reduce the legal risks of companies, but it will definitely not provide companies with the license to operate. That, at the end of the day, is what is needed to move forward in the energy transition. So to aggravate this, what we also observe is that indigenous peoples have not benefited from energy-related projects. Generally, they have been excluded from economic benefits, but even in terms of the access to energy, we see that indigenous peoples are marginalized. And that, again, has further human rights implications, because access to energy may be your key to other human rights, such as access to information, health, education, and so on. So the overall consequences of this is that indigenous peoples are carrying the negative impacts without even having the most basic participation in the benefits. And that conflates into a very real and undeniable experience of indigenous peoples of the negative impact of energy projects as just another continuation of destructive practices of imposed development. So when we talk about energy transition, we have to reverse that that situation, which seems to constitute like an insurmountable barrier for establishing even a meaningful dialogue. It becomes almost impossible to assess and explore to what extent actually indigenous people's priorities for development, energy transition, national priorities for development could be compatible. So I think that it from the surface of the conflicts, it may look as if we have to choose between rights and development, but I also think that it's a very false choice or false dichotomy between human rights and development. And I just want to mention one example from Chile. When Chile, the former government of Chile, adopted its national energy policy, which has quite ambitious targets for energy transition, it also came out with a specific section or chapter of that policy, specifically on indigenous people's rights in the context of energy. And that, I should say, again, emerged from a historical context of severe conflicts with hydropower projects causing displacement of indigenous Mapuche communities in Chile. So this indigenous section of the policy was developed in a participatory manner through comprehensive consultations with indigenous organizations. It has 5 elements. So 1, it aims to ensure that projects do adhere to indigenous people's rights. Secondly, it aims to strengthen energy generation by indigenous peoples themselves. Third, it aims to ensure equity in the access to energy services, closing the gaps between indigenous and non-indigenous population. It aims to promote information and capacity building on energy choices for indigenous communities. And finally, it aims to enhance energy efficiency within indigenous communities, including through diversifying energy sources and promoting more efficient use of firewood. So it really comes up with a comprehensive collection of components to address the situation of indigenous peoples in the energy sector. I take that as an encouraging example of how it can be addressed in a national policy. However, there is a latent risk that conflicts or negative impacts in other projects or processes will reflect negatively back on an otherwise constructive process. So I have no doubt, I mean, I have been involved in some of the capacity building efforts in Chile. I have no doubt it will take time and pioneering action by champions to overcome this historical experience of violation of rights. And we also see in Chile, for example, that financial institutions do not have confidence in community-generated projects. So reversing this situation requires a long-term and concerted efforts of states and their development partners, including both communities and companies. Sorry, Joanne, you're muted. I cannot hear you.
Yeah, here. Yeah, okay. Now, just maybe can you expound a bit more on what can be the channels or avenues to advance respect for human rights and in relation to renewable energy under, for example, now the SDG processes?
Yeah, I actually want to try to share my screen here. I mean, I think as a point of departure, we have the right frameworks. We have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have Convention 169 that has been ratified by Norway, Nepal, Chile, and other countries mentioned here. And these instruments, they are underpinned by the full range of human rights. So that is our point of departure, and I want to point specifically to Convention 169, which requires comprehensive participatory impact assessment, both social, spiritual, cultural, and environmental impact assessment as the foundation for decision making, which means that Indigenous peoples have to be drawn into the process much before, including at the policy level. We have the 2030 agenda and specifically SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy. So that agenda constitutes another platform for dialogue. So if we take human rights and the Sustainable Development Agenda as complementary frameworks, we do have a platform for dialogue, for coherence, and for avoiding these false trade-offs between human rights and development. And with human rights, we can avoid the externalization of negative impact, so that it's not Indigenous peoples who have to carry the burden of those. The 2030 agenda is also very strong in promoting new partnerships. And I think that, I mean, at the bottom of my heart, I do believe that Indigenous peoples and companies do have a shared interest in avoiding those conflicts and establishing a new type of partnerships. But that dialogue has to span all the way from policy to project levels. I don't think it's easy. I think it's about building trust in the process, and those who have created those negative experiences for Indigenous peoples should make the first move in order to actually build that trust through concrete examples. We have to reverse the role of Indigenous peoples as being the victims of externally imposed projects to become active partners and proponents of their own development, and also make their contribution to the development of broader society possible. So strengthen Indigenous peoples as economic actors, and of course at the project level, establishing the operational policies and regulations aligned with Indigenous peoples' rights that will clarify the requirements and the expectations for companies and for individual projects. So I think that more or less capture our main lessons learned here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. That gives a very good entry point for my brief presentation on the Right Energy Partnership that Indigenous peoples have initiated. And so just to quickly mention that because of the threats and actual violations of rights of indigenous peoples in renewable energy. And at the same time, indigenous peoples need renewable energy in their territories. The Indigenous Peoples Major Group has initiated what we call the Right Energy Partnership with two goals. One is to promote and ensure the respect for the rights of indigenous peoples in renewable energy development, meaning that it should be fully aligned to the UN Declaration, ensure the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples as the means to have a partnership with indigenous peoples. So that's the first. The second one is for indigenous peoples to have access to renewable energy, because 73% of indigenous peoples are in rural areas and majority do not have access to energy, while their territories are actually hosting a lot of energy. If you look at the case of Nepal, for example, the remote communities do not have energy, but those are the areas where dams are also being built. So it's ironical that all this energy are being developed, not for the people, but more for business, no? And those the corporations that have the technology. So the Right Energy partnership that the indigenous peoples have initiated has now gained support by different actors. We have the UNDP that has already committed to provide a budget of $1 million that will be accessed by indigenous communities for their own community-based renewable energy, for example. And we also have partnerships now with several foundations in relation to our advocacy campaign for renewable energy companies to align themselves to the respect for human rights, including conducting human rights due diligence in areas where they are having renewable energy. So this is basically what the Right Energy Partnership is all about. And we are encouraging indigenous organizations and other actors to join us, because we believe that this kind of partnership that is driven by rights holders as indigenous peoples, as rights holders, but also as development actors, this is the kind of partnership that we need to combat climate change and also to advance sustainable development. Because without the respect for human rights, we will not achieve both. And the Right Energy Partnership is providing the means where we can work together to address these global issues. And we believe that indigenous peoples play a critical role in on sustainable development and climate change solutions. So I'm on the screen, you can see the reports and publications already made by the Indigenous Peoples Major Group. So I encourage you to read these materials, and please keep in touch with the Indigenous Peoples Major Group if you want to know more about the Right Energy Partnership. So I want to end with that, and I see there's a lot of very interesting comments and questions that are coming in the Q&A, but also in the chat box. So maybe quickly, there are questions addressed to you, Christina, in relation to the projects in Norway, including also how is the ILO 169 being operated, how is this being used to uphold the rights of indigenous peoples in relation to this kind of projects. So, and there are also a question on the role of the Sami parliament. So these are the related questions to you, Christina. And there are also related questions to you, Prabin, in the case of the dams and FPIC in Nepal. So I would like to ask Christina to respond to those questions quickly, and then also for Prabin to respond to the questions addressed to him. So Christina, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. And I can very much understand why you are asking about ILO Convention number 169, as Norway was the first to ratify that back in the days. Well, I must say that in Norway, we as the Sami people experience that the ILO Convention provide us with some rights or implement some rights in some spheres of the society. But when it comes to consultation and when it comes to intervention on Sami land, there seems to be an assumption in the government and the authorities that they can select whether an issue is affecting the Sami community or not, and whether they are obliged to consult on that, and that is a problem. At the moment, the Sami Parliament is in the phase of well, there have been negotiations and consultations for many years, but there seems to be a law on consultation on its way, possibly being adopted by the Norwegian Parliament next year. So that might be a path forward. But in the cases that I mentioned and plenty other cases, the ILO Convention is more a paper than something that is implemented. Although Norway has just been included in the UN Security Council on the basis of them being highlighted as a best practice example on human rights, it does not always seem to apply internally in Norway, and that is very challenging. As for the Sami Parliament's role in these particular issues, they have not been able to. They've not been taking part in the court cases, but they have been supporting the Sami communities and also been, of course, consulted. The Sami Parliament is the Sami authority we have in the Norwegian side, and is definitely involved in consultations with government on these matters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that response, Christina. Praveen, can you respond to the questions to you? And I would also like to ask Brigitte later to also respond to the questions addressed to her.
Yeah, I
Praveen?
think I think there was a similar question regarding use of Convention 169 in Nepal. Of course,
Yes.
Nepal is the only only country in Asia to have ratified ILO Convention 169 so far. It's a matter of pride per se, but also a matter of stigma to us, because though it's the only country in Asia to have ratified Convention 169, I think and it also recognizes certain indigenous communities as in laws. The legal framework of Nepal still does not provide for respect or recognition of indigenous land tenure system or respect for their indigenous land. We ratified the government ratified Convention 169 in 2007 when there was a different political context. The indigenous movement was very strong politically, but 13 years later now, the government still has not approved a national action plan on how it is going to implement the Convention 169. So as a result, the indigenous movement has continuously pushed the government to come up with a plan to implement the convention, as well as some certain legal reforms that are urgently required. So that definitely also affects how hydropower projects respect or do not respect the rights of indigenous peoples in their implementation or construction. There was another question about the project
FPIC.
the FPIC model in the Upper Trishuli one project. I have not first-hand witnessed the project myself, so I might not be the best person to answer it. However, earlier when there was a case study undertaken with regards to the project, there was great concerns among the communities regarding, again, communal lands, customary lands, and also lack of consultation and adequate compensation. Later, what happened was there were the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, and the Korean companies that are building the Upper Trishuli 1 project. worked or collaborated with Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, NEFIN, and through that, which is a let's say a representative organization of indigenous peoples in the country. So through them, they were able to undertake a series of consultations with the affected communities, develop an EFPIC agreement or EFPIC protocol, as they said, and also that also was accompanied by a local socio-economic development plan. No, and that is, again, I'm speaking through a secondary information that I've collected. So that might have built certain social license to operate, for that project, which might have been projected as EFPIC, or as EFPIC being obtained in that project. I think the key here is, again, how that project and the project developers, IFC and Korean companies engage with the company through a credible organization like NEFIN, and the local ethnic organizations, and towards a series of consultations. I think that was the key. But again, I might not be the right person to say if that was the model process, or the best process that might have that is being used in hydropower development discourse around the world. But I would also say that we should take that experience with a pinch of salt, because, as I said in the beginning of my earlier as I said in the beginning, in Nepal, hydropower is seen as the only pathway for development of the country, and it is very difficult for any community or any affected communities to challenge hydropower or say no to it. So at least getting certain rights respected might have been the way for the communities in the case of the Upper Trishuli 1 project too, which is also a similar experience being faced by Tano hydropower project and the indigenous Moga communities that are affected. They know that they cannot say no to the project, and also I don't think they want to say no to the project. But I think and they are trying to have a good faith negotiation again for their land rights, land for land resettlement, land for land compensation, and having better participation in the process, and to get respect for their free, prior, and informed consent in the construction of the project.
Okay, thanks for that, Praveen. Birgitte, there are also questions to you in relation to ILO 169 and also FPIC. Can you respond to that quickly?
Yes, that's a lengthy discussion, but I will keep it. I mean, there was a question about whether the right to free, prior, and informed consent constitutes a veto. And let me just say that the requirement for consultation, participation in decision making, and consent, it applies at all levels of governance, from the policy level to adoption of legislation to specific projects. And the requirement for really only going forward if there is consent depends on the impact on those who are giving or withholding their consent. So if you have some sort of legislation that may eventually have a minor impact on some communities, but generally, most indigenous communities are okay with the proposed legislation or whatever, you can have a situation where you can find a balance and move forward. But if you have a project that has direct and severe implications on indigenous communities, the project should not go forward without consent. And there is a jurisprudence to support that from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights that made an assessment of exactly that in the context of an energy project in Suriname. And I think that it also connects to what I said before about the requirement under Convention 169 to undertake social, economic, cultural, and spiritual impact assessments under the convention. It's a requirement under the convention, and it's something that very rarely is happening, but it's only through these impact assessments that you can actually measure including, for example, impacts on cultural sites, sacred sites, etc., only the concerned communities will know. It leads back to another question that was also posted in the chat about the definition of indigenous peoples in Africa, because of course there are many countries in Africa, many governments in Africa that do not accept the term indigenous peoples. However, their projects are impacting on communities who self-identify as indigenous and who comply with the objective requirements, for example, under Convention 169 for identification. And there, I think we should highlight that companies and financial institutions, especially financial institutions that are often behind these projects, as we also heard from Nepal, they can actually say, we apply our policy on indigenous peoples to this community, although the government does not recognize them as such. So I think it's part of the due diligence requirement that Jesse also talked about. And finally, just to say that the ILO does have complaints mechanisms. So apart from the regular monitoring of whether a state is complying with its obligations, there are also specific complaints mechanisms. So perhaps some of these cases could also be brought to the attention of the ILO.
Okay, thank you for that. I see the hand of Basiru being raised. Ivan, can you give Basiru the mic? But in the meantime, there is a question here on what type of renewable energy is less invasive for indigenous territory. It could be for any panelist, but maybe I can respond to this, that I think the main point here is, regardless of the form, what we need to look at is what kind of impacts it has, particularly on the livelihoods of communities, the areas, because like, for example, in the case of Norway, the area for the windmill is actually being used for reindeer herding. So if they plan, for example, to have windmill, they should bring it in areas where it's not being used by the people, and that could be a possibility. The same way with a number of solar farms, right? So and there are also questions like, for example, geothermal plants. Many of them are being planned in sacred sites. And so there's a lot of opposition because those are sacred mountains for indigenous peoples. But if it's an area that's not being used by indigenous peoples, I think there's an openness for people to consider, as long as there are no adverse impacts to them. So it's really more a question on the impacts of the project, more than than being invasive or not, or that's the way we can define the issue of the with the invasiveness, quote and unquote, of any kind of project. Now, Basiru is still closed, but I see Felix. If you can...
I am open now.
Okay, so I'll call Basiru quickly, and then Felix and Henry. I'll give you 2 minutes each to give your comments or questions. Okay, Basiru.
Yeah, Joanne, thank you, and thank you for all the panelists who gave a very interesting overview. And from their presentations from the different regions, it really shows that indigenous people really have a unique definition. That is, they have the same problems. They have they are fighting the same issues around the world, be it in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, or in Latin America. So that's it, and I think somebody said it. What I would like to comment is on access to land, because I think it will be very important that indigenous people have access to energy. It is very important, but don't forget that anytime there are development projects or anytime there are development issues like access to land, access to roads leading to indigenous people territories, it is instead exposing indigenous people to expropriation from their lands. So I think while we are promoting access to energy to indigenous people, we should also, in a parallel, be working on how to secure their territories. Yeah. Because if we don't secure their territories, once these areas have access to energy and they are developed, different communities will come and push indigenous people out of those communities. And indigenous people will pass their time bringing projects that will develop territories that they don't own and they will not belong. So I think Indigenous People Right International is a big opportunity in which one of the axes should be on how to secure indigenous people rights, territories, especially their territories, because I know we have been supporting so many people, indigenous defenders, but I think if we change the paradigms and now invest on how to access territories, like so many countries I'm seeing around Africa are pushing for that, but it is very, very, very low. And I think it will help so much so that we should not bring development that will send indigenous people out of their territories. Or we should not bring, yeah, thank you very much. That's what I wanted to comment.
That's well said, Basiru, that indigenous territories needs to be secured. Yeah. Felix? Felix?
Muchas gracias a todos los hermanos que están.
Thank you very much to all the brothers and sisters that are taking part in this event. Since 2009 in Chile, we've been trying to build useful energy so that we can guarantee energy for everyone, but in a proper way. Having electricity and having water has never been a problem, indeed. But it is a problem to know where this energy comes from. Here in Chile, we've approved an energy policy. And what we want to do is to guarantee that the indigenous people take part in the decision-making process, and we also want to guarantee that the enterprises and the corporations work within the law. Moreover, we've been trying to give the spiritual factor the importance that it has, and also to give the indigenous people the opportunity to put their values in practice as professionals as well.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Felix. I think that's really important to see how the new policy is going to be implemented in good faith by all those involved, from the companies to the government and indigenous peoples. And I think if it's implemented properly, this is the one that we want to see also in relation to having the respect for the rights of indigenous peoples, and at the same time contributing to combating climate change and sustainable development. So I think I believe that the policy in Chile is a good model to start this kind of partnership. And the Right Energy Partnership is really looking forward to work in Chile to move this policy. Okay, we have Harry. Can you quickly comment your question or comment, Harry? Harry? You're on. Yes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for for sharing your ideas here in this event. I wanted to ask something about the free consent and consultation. For example, we tried to conduct this consultation and we tried to follow the protocol. However, I believe that one thing is to ask our brothers or sisters if we are going to carry out a project that impacts our communities. And I wanted to ask you in this regard if you had any experience in any community, in any territory, about how to conduct this consultation to Mother Earth, to nature, to plants, trees, lands, animals. How can we ask them for consent? Since, for example, in Bolivia, we already have the Act 300,
Okay.
the Mother Earth Act. And in 2009, on the 22nd of April, was acknowledged by the UN as the Mother Earth Day. So how can we ask Mother Earth for its consent?
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Harry. Sorry, Victor, we don't have the time now. We only have 8 minutes, and I want to get back to the speakers for their quick conclusion or concluding remarks, particularly on what actions are needed now to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are respected in renewable energy projects, particularly, well, we had a strong discussion, questions on free, prior, and informed consent, benefit sharing, compensation, recognition of land rights. These are the critical issues for indigenous peoples. But at the same time, indigenous peoples are also interested to have access to renewable energy. It's not as if we don't need it, but the way it's being done it's done in the wrong way. So I want to get back to our panelists for some quick remarks, and if you can still try to respond to whatever comments or that from our participants. So maybe we can start with Jessie.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for just such a fascinating conversation. I think going forward, what we really need to see is that the starting point of one is the commitment to even having a human rights policy or committing to the UNGPs. And that's actually something that a lot of companies in the renewable energy sector aren't already doing. It's been brought up a little bit throughout the conversation, but I think one of the issues with renewable energy companies and investors in renewable energy companies is that they see themselves as the good guy. So they're not actually necessarily looking for these issues because they're not aware they exist. They don't think they exist. And one of the pieces of feedback we got from companies that particularly rated well in our benchmark, was that it opened up a new area that they didn't know that they were failing at. And that was a good thing for them to be able to improve. However, I still think that there is a disconnect, and this is where governments and civil society need to come in as well, between policy and to practice. And that's why at the Resource Centre, we continue to record these allegations, because we know that having a policy doesn't mean that a company will respect it. And we know that what's happening at the headquarter levels is not necessarily happening at the project levels. So there's an accountability lesson, I think, that we need to take from that. At the same time, we know that there are better ways forward, and we didn't have, opportunities in this discussion. I think specifically there are some Canadian examples where companies have worked with communities through like co-ownership of the company, or impact assessment models together, or benefit sharing, as we said, having access to the energy that's produced. And I think Canada really leads the way in having communities where they set the rules, they set the terms, and they get the benefits as well. And I think we need to see a rapid increase of that, or we're going to lose the entire social license to operate and then not be able to continue the transition itself. So I'll stop there, but I think that's where we need to go forward. And thank you very much for having the Resource Center here.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jessie. Thanks a lot for also mentioning a good practice because we need to show that it can be done, that there is a right way to do this. And as long as we enter into a good faith and really respect the dignity of indigenous peoples and respect their aspirations, I think we can go the right way. Thank you for pointing that out, Jessie, that there exist good examples. Christina, is there any parting words from you?
Yes, thank you very much for that. Well, I would start with saying if the issue was only the renewable energy projects, right, then the conversation might have been different in the Sami areas. But as I mentioned, it comes on top of all of these other interventions on Sami territories. So there's this massive loss of land affecting the mental health of individuals and affecting our communities. So it's not necessarily talking about human rights being with examples of violence or murder. It's putting this pressure constantly on people, on communities, that happens because there is a lack of a holistic view on the industrial development. So while the indigenous peoples and the Sami people face the climate changes and face all these impacts all the time, we at the same time made responsible for finding the solutions and making room for all kinds of projects that is supposed to solve the crisis. We are supposed to make room for the wind power plants to provide with the renewable energy. We're supposed to give room for mining, to extract these critical minerals, and we are supposed to make way for railways because people need to travel by train. But we don't have any more space to give. So it's not about being against renewable energy. So I think and there is also this constant imbalance of power between indigenous communities and the government and business, but also between the government and the business. And it should not be that way, as the business is putting so much pressure on government and getting their way. The government should set the premises and follow the principles that you're referring to. The state should protect the indigenous peoples and put the demands on the business. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I think that's that shows that when governments impose all the things that they want to do without proper participation and engagement with the communities that's affected, this kind of solutions are not going to sit well with the land owners, the indigenous peoples. And I think that's a big lesson to learn, that when this kind of projects are being imposed on indigenous peoples, it really affects our dignity, our culture, and that we are not seen as equals. And that's where the problem also starts. So now, Praveen, any parting words from you? Quickly, 1 minute.
Okay, just again, I'll just speak in the context of the Tanahu communities, the communities affected by Tanahu hydropower project. I think for the specific actions that I see, I think are urgently needed are greater efforts from the investors, such as the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, and the other international financial institutions that are financing these hydropower development or renewable energy projects. I'm targeting particularly the investors because in the context of countries such as Nepal that are heavily dependent on aid, and legal reforms are very difficult to come unless there is a significant political change. The communities see these investors or the complaint mechanisms that they have as their recourse to access, as their recourse to justice, as their way to justice. But again, what we find is that these complaint mechanisms are also limited by their safeguard policies, which are often not in line with international human rights standards. FPIC is often narrowly defined as broad community support, it's not it's not defined as per the aspirations of the community. Like some and these days these investor banks are also putting a lot of priority on country systems, as they call it, which gives preeminence to the legal systems of the country where the project is located. And new banks such as Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank are even just using free, prior, and informed consultation against the international human rights standard of free, prior, and informed consent. So I think, for the forthcoming 10 year of UN guiding principles on business and human rights, I think these investor banks, these international financial institutions should put more greater effort on, so that the business projects that they are financing have greater respect for human rights and indigenous rights.
Okay, well said. Okay, Birgitte, any parting words?
Thank you. I know I have 30 seconds, so I'll be very brief. We will be working with our sister organizations, with the National Human Rights Institute of Denmark, but we work with national human rights institutions, Las Defensorías del Pueblo, across the globe, and we will be working specifically on this issue of energy transition and indigenous people's rights. We're also in the process of elaborating training modules on exactly this. And perhaps we expect those to be finished beginning of next year, January, February, and we will be happy to share those with you through the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and other channels. So hopefully these can also be useful. So looking forward to continuing the dialogue and collaboration with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you as well. We've already reached the time, unfortunately, and there's so many open-ended discussions, if I may say, that have surfaced in the conversations that we had around indigenous peoples and renewable energy. There are clearly issues around respect for human rights of indigenous peoples as a fundamental in relation to renewable energy projects. At the same time, there are opportunities to be building partnerships with indigenous peoples in the framework of respecting their rights, and also dealing with indigenous peoples, engaging with indigenous peoples as development actors. And if we only come into defining a common ground that respects human rights, that respects indigenous peoples as development actors, that we need real solutions for climate change, then this is the way forward for us to resolve this global issues. So I want to thank all those who have joined this webinar. We can share to you the materials, our speakers that have produced materials on these issues. If you're interested, we can share them to you. We can also share some of the PowerPoints, but please feel free to get in touch with us to continue this kind of discussion and possible collaboration with you as we advance human rights in the context of renewable energy, and we hope that we will contribute more to next week in the conduct of the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. Again, thank you to all our speakers and thank you to all the participants for your also engagement in this discussion, and also thank you to all my colleagues. Thank you to all the interpreters, and also again thank you to our co-organizers of this webinar. So have a good day, everyone, and thank you. Kindly please respond to the polls, I mean the evaluation form, and those that have questions still, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
I ano mo,